This meeting is being recorded.
Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome everyone on today's first IBM Blockchain Central and Eastern Europe webinar about Hyperledger Fabric 2.0. Today we will be talking about the enhancements, the improvements, and new functionalities that have been introduced by the new release of Fabric. My name is Maciej Jędrzejczyk. I am a Central and Eastern Europe blockchain technical leader at IBM. And let's move straight to the agenda. So before we go to the main topic of today's session, just a very quick recap of what IBM does with regards to blockchain. So first of all, IBM's strategy is focusing on bringing appropriate toolsets, a platform that is based on Hyperledger Fabric to build, deploy, and maintain highly scalable enterprise applications on the blockchain. We also provide ready-made solutions that allow for building end-to-end capabilities for a business, whether it is in the finance, in supply chain, or any other industry. We tap upon a huge ecosystem of our partners and clients, and we serve as a networking partner to create consortia and cooperatives that are building together and founding new business networks based on blockchain. And last but not least, we provide services to help our clients identifying an appropriate use case for the blockchain, planning and deploying a blockchain network, building an application on top of it, and maintaining an existing network across all of the organizations. Our default technology stack that we're using across the vast majority of our projects is IBM Blockchain Platform, which is an enterprise package, suite of tools and scripts that are basically automating and facilitating and accelerating the deployment, development, and building of new applications using or leveraging Hyperledger Fabric. It is available as a software as a service on IBM Cloud and also as a software suite that can be deployed on premise on any infrastructure of your choice. So my assumption for today is that you already know what is Hyperledger Fabric. To those who, for any reason, have not had any prior experience with the platform, just a very quick recap. Hyperledger Fabric is a de facto standard or dominant platform for building enterprise applications for businesses in regulated industries. It provides an extensive toolset to deploy the distributed ledger, smart contract, different consensus services, and also provides the necessary confidentiality, privacy, and scalability level that is required by enterprise clients. Today, we will be talking about version 2.0. For your information, version 2.0.1 with a small fix has been released in the end of February 2020. In parallel, there is still a version 1.4, currently at .6 sub-release, that is still maintained and has a long-term service tag. So please keep that in mind. IBM is one of the main contributing organizations to the development and maintenance of Hyperledger Fabric, and does so as part of Hyperledger organization. So where are we right now in terms of Hyperledger Fabric roadmap? The story started in July 2017 when version 1.0 was introduced. So it took us around 2 years, or more than 2 years, in order to arrive to version 2.0, which has been released in the beginning of this year and gives us a number of enhancements and features that we will be talking about, revolving around a decentralized chain code governance, external chain code support, private data improvements, programming model improvements, and performance improvements. However, this is definitely not the end of development process. There are already new features which are planned for upcoming releases. And I strongly recommend that you always take a look at the up-to-date roadmap that is available on Hyperledger Fabric Jira website, whereby you can learn more about the upcoming features such as post-order execution, token management system, new ordering service networks for the consensus, such as BFT, checkpointing and pruning of ledgers, and new privacy enhancements. So to summarize, or to provide you with an executive summary, we should talk about what is going to be the topic of today's session. So we will be focusing on the improvements and the features coming in with Hyperledger Fabric 2.0 that revolve around three main technical and operational enhancements. The first one is the main focus is at the chain code lifecycle. Decisions that can be done are much more flexible right now. The organizations can be more autonomous in terms of how and when and in what form the chain code is going to be deployed on Fabric. The second improvement set comes with private data collections, which give us now a possibility to have implicit per organization collections, and also a better management and more granularity in terms of who gets what sort of data and at what point. And there is also a number of security and performance improvements that I will be talking subsequently about. It is also very important to mention that this release does not introduce something that some of the people have waited for, which is a token management model. So as you probably know, FAB token has been removed after a transition of Fabric 2.0 alpha to beta. The whole concept is now being repurposed and considered again to make sure that it is going to be satisfactory to enterprise clients. So it's definitely not abandoned. It's simply that it's going to be released later on throughout 2020. The BFT consensus is also currently on the roadmap. However, it is not introduced in Fabric 2.0. There are some attempts made by different organizations belonging to Hyperledger that are independently working on different BFT consensus systems. And it is very likely that one of these is going to become an integral part of Fabric code base this year. There are no real improvements or enhancements at Fabric CA component or the zero knowledge proofs, such as Identity Mixer. It stays exactly where it is right now. But from what I have seen on Jira, there are some plans to update these as well. So one very important thing from the perspective of support, Hyperledger Fabric 2.0 is not tagged as an LTS release. The mailing list says that probably at some point after the second quarter of 2020, a decision is going to be made. Fabric 2.0 is going to receive such a tag. But as for now, the LTS tag is exclusively assigned to version 1.4, which is still being developed against fixes and bugs which are identified here and there. So this brings a clear message. You do not have to rush to move from 1.4 to 2.0 because it is very likely that 1.4 is going to be supported by the community at least until mid 2020. So let's move to what's new in chain code. And we will start with a decentralized governance that brings new patterns for collaboration and consensus. So right now, in Hyperledger Fabric 2.0, it will be possible to set up a new policy, which is called lifecycle endorsement, that is going to specify which organizations are required to approve a chain code definition that is going to be deployed or upgraded in a channel. This comes through the endorsement during the chain code lifecycle process, and it can be defined either as a rule or it can be a more explicit endorsement that is setting specific organizations responsible for that task. With regards to the life cycle, the installation of chain code has changed in Hyperledger Fabric 2.0. There is I would say, more deliberate chain code installation and upgrade process. So right now, each organization is going to be fully independent in terms of what sort of chain code is going to be installed and packaged on their respective peers. We are going to talk about the fact that chain code can differ in form, but I will be talking about later on. So there's a full independence in terms of that, and in a way, this is done operationally. Individual organizations can call the lifecycle system at any point of their readiness to introduce a new version of code. And once a number of organizations is going to endorse and approve by endorsing a new chain code, and this is something that is governed by the lifecycle policy, which I mentioned about in a previous slide, then that chain code is going to be committed into the channel and then become a new version of the business logic used by all organizations. So this is definitely helping all of the organizations to make appropriate installation and updates at their own pace without having to be forced by a single entity that is going to decide whether or not a new release of a business logic is going to be introduced, something that was the case in Hyperledger Fabric 1.4. If you remember the pure chain code install and pure chain code instantiate functions. The same goes for the upgrades. So the process has slightly changed, but follows the installation, which I mentioned in the previous slide. So first of all, the repackaging of the chain code is optional and is only valid if the chain code content has been updated. The installation takes place by different organizations managing their own peers. The approval process then moves on in exact the same way as in the installation process. Once a necessary number of approvals is obtained, there is a commitment of a new definition to the channel, and that chain code becomes fully operational for all of the participants. There is a possibility to upgrade the chain code container, but it's not necessary in case no real chain code has been changed, but only the definition itself. So what are the typical deployment scenarios that we can expect, which are enhancing this collaboration, which I mentioned in the beginning between the organizations? So a new organization can join a channel and start using chain code immediately after joining to a specific channel in which that chain code is deployed. There's no need to go through the commitment process again. the default lifecycle endorsement policy is going to change automatically. The updating of an endorsement policy can be done without repackaging or reinstalling the chain code. This is quite an improvement in comparison to Hyperledger Fabric 1.4, and is going to take effect immediately after it is committed through the voting process. So there is no need to make any updates to the chain code itself by introducing the new package, and thus by having to operationally manage the chain code container. There is a possibility to approve a definition without installing the chain code. This is something that arises from the fact that the definition is completely decoupled from the chain code lifecycle, something that I will be talking about in a couple of seconds. But this, in practice, that organizations can participate in an approval process of a new chain code definition policy without having the actual copy of a chain code itself, which can be quite important when it comes to the organizations that are important from the perspective of consensus, but are not participating actively in any of the transactions that are defined by the business logic within the chain code. There are some conflict scenarios whereby the lifecycle policy isn't going to be applied, and this is quite important to take into account. An organization, for instance, can disagree on chain code definition. There is no need for all of the organizations to have an express agreement. So it's a typical voting mechanism, and disagreement is one of the options. And therefore, in that situation, this organization that disagrees cannot use the chain code until it changes the mind and approves the definition, or if a new definition is introduced that is going to be expressly approved by that organization. The organizations with different chain code definitions will not be able to execute the chain code on their peers. So there has to be uniformity across all of the organizations in terms of which definition is governing a specific set of chain codes. And if there's a disparity in this area, then it is not going to be possible to use these chain codes as well. There is a possibility for the other organizations in the channel to use chain codes with an approved definition, while the others still disagree on that definition. So a single organization cannot explicitly block the entire policy commitment process. There is a possibility that the channel is not going to agree overall on a specific definition, and very similar policies apply, which means that if the organizations approve definitions that do not match, or if there's not enough of explicit votes coming from different organizations, then the definition is not going to be enforced, and therefore any chain code that is attached to it would not be able to be used. One of the very interesting improvements or features coming with Hyperledger Fabric is the fact that chain code packages are now inspectable. So right now, the chain code can be packaged into a tar.gz file that can be decompressed and verified against the content. It contains the chain code as well as the metadata that describes the package content. It is quite important, especially when the organizations want to go through a full security check and an audit of an underlying business logic before approving it for the rollout. And it used to be quite of an issue in the past whenever the organizations received an already compiled version of the chain code. which could not be inspected thoroughly. So this is a very important thing. This is something that I said a couple of minutes ago. The logic on peer and the chain code definition are completely decoupled. And this provides us with some completely new ways for the management of new releases of the business logic. So when it comes to the chain code itself, it gives us, or the organizations, a possibility to use a completely different package from the one that is provided by one of the organizations. So we can build our own package. We can even build our own chain code in our own runtime of our choice. So there is a possibility to have one chain code in Golang and another chain code in Node.js. And unless until those chain codes are going to produce exactly the same results in form of read-write sets, then they will be still valid and considered as correct from the perspective of endorsement policies. Multiple definitions can be used to run different instances of the chain code. So we can have the same chain code with a number of different endorsement policies depending on what kind of governance or the granularity for the governance is needed in a given channel. This is quite important thing. Someone is requesting to annotate. I will refuse that request, but let's discuss that on the chat, in the chat window. Please post your question and I'll try to respond to it after the presentation, okay? So what are the possible use cases that we can use these features for? So first one is something that I already talked about. Now the organizations are free to make some small changes, fixes, correct the bugs without requiring that the entire channel just basically stops and waits until the given chain code is installed at all organizations and instantiation happens. Here, each organization can deploy a new version of the chain codes at their own pace and by using their own processes that may take more time than for the other organizations. And this is not stopping all of the others from still committing new transactions. The second use case is may take place when you can use the same chain code package and just deploy it multiple times with different definitions attached to it, and therefore you can have a single business logic but deployed with completely different namespaces to make sure that separate governance policies and assets are being treated separately depending on the namespace and the number of organizations that are inside the endorsement policy for a given chain code. So it's definitely improving on operational readiness and management of potential complexities arising from having different releases of exactly the same chain code being deployed at the same time, just in order to have separate namespaces. Here we can do it at once and decouple by using different definitions for different chain codes within the package. There is also an external chain code support. So everyone who knows, who has been trying to deploy Hyperledger Fabric 1.4 on Kubernetes knows that there's been some intrinsic security issue that was preventing the peer chain code from deploying, the peer container from deploying a chain code container because it required root privileges to an underlying Docker daemon. So that was a showstopper for many of the organizations. There were some workarounds in the Kubernetes sphere. So in most of the cases, a Docker in Docker functionality was being used in order to overcome the limitation arising from the default security settings of Kubernetes platform. Now this has changed, and it is possible to define your own way for deploying an external chain code and to completely externalize that process. Technically speaking, it's not even needed to have a chain code in a container right now. You can define different tools to manage the deployment and maintenance of chain codes. You can still run it on Docker host, and it's still a default choice, but you can attach your own builder and the tool sets if you want to avoid using Docker host and use some other means, such as, for example, Kubernetes. Other enhancements for the chain codes is an introduction of a support for Node.js and Java, which means that it's now possible to use Node.js 12 and Java 11 in order to develop the chain codes in these runtimes. There is also an introduction of a new high-level programming model for Go smart contracts. I know that there is a vast community of developers, blockchain developers, who are developing in Go. This is, for instance, a common practice in our team in Central and Eastern Europe, simply due to performance enhancements that a Go chain code can obtain in comparison to other runtimes. So this is definitely a welcome change, and it's up to all of us to decide if we want to stick to the previous way of developing Go smart contracts, or if we want to apply the high-level programming model. Okay. So this is for the chain code. What's new now? Let's switch to private data collections. So one of the new features coming for private data collections is a possibility to control who is reading and writing into a collection. So in the past, it was possible for an application that was executed by an organization that is not explicitly in a collection to query the ledger of one of the organizations that are in a collection, and to make an attempt to read or write the content of a collection. This is now controllable, which means that there are new attributes called member-only reads and member-only write that allow for the organizations to better control who can access the data that is within a collection and that is defined by the collection policy, and thus remove a possibility for non-member organizations to perform such operations. The new feature is also a possibility to share and verify private data on the go. So first of all, there is right now the private data collections are implicitly set per organization, so there is no need to define them up front, but you can change it so that you can dynamically assign an endorsement policy without upgrading the entire chain code. Which gives you a possibility to pass on the access to the private part of the data from one organization to another organization on a need-to-know basis. And if any organization wants to verify the integrity of data that is represented by hashes in a distributed ledger layer, then it is possible to invoke functions such as getPrivateDataHash in order to be able to check the hashes against the private data while that data is moving from one organization to another. So this gives us a possibility to have an even more granular access to the data and possibility to verify the data on the go without a need to completely update the entire chain code whenever the collection policy has to change because a new organization is introduced into a business transaction, for example. Last but not least, there is a collection level endorsement policy. So in the past, any member could write to a collection if a transaction had an adequate endorsement. Now it is possible to specify an endorsement policy for each private data collection. So it is possible to apply that and thus to override the chain code level endorsement policy. And to that in effect gives us a possibility to write to a collection for the organizations that want to participate in some parts of the business logic execution. If we move on to security and performance enhancements, there's one of the major features comes for CouchDB, which in the past usually was considered as a bottleneck from the transactional perspective. The Hyperledger Fabric 2.0 provides a peer cache that gives a possibility to keep all of the queries in memory and thus allow for any of the indexing transactions and querying against CouchDB in a much more let's say transactional efficient manner. So it can be configured as a cache size attribute and defined as a certain amount of memory that can be used by the peer container in order to cache the responses that can be then reused if another query is asking for exactly the same data. So according to some preliminary verifications and tests, this brings 10 to 20% performance improvement, which might be quite important when we want to use CouchDB because of its indexing and pagination capabilities. There are new enhancements to the ordering service network. There is the ordering service nodes can now do or perform transactions in parallel that is also introducing new transaction performance improvements. I haven't seen any particular studies that are showing to what extent are these improvements or how these improvements are showing up on the overall transaction duration. So this is still yet to be discovered. So hopefully this is going to shorten the amount of time and potential delays between the moment when the transaction candidate is submitted by the client and the moment when the candidate block is distributed by the OSN to the peers. Other enhancements come to the SDK, Fabric Components, and chain code shim. So there's I've seen a Jira that entry that is defining that there's a simplified wallet management for Node.js and Java SDK. And I haven't looked too much into the details of it, but I'm just noting it down if anyone wants to explore it further. The shim package and dependencies for Go chain code are no longer included in the build. So it's important to keep that in mind when you start thinking about migrating your Go chain code from 1.4 to 2.0. There are new logging mechanisms as well to keep in mind. Some very important thing from the perspective of existing Fabric components is the fact that Solo and Kafka consensus type are now in deprecated state. It's not removed yet, but it's a clear sign that these two aren't going to be further developed, which means that we should focus our attention on either migrating from Kafka to Raft, or if we are deploying a completely new network, to focus on Raft exclusively. There is a possibility to specify the order endpoints at the global level in the channel configuration, but this feature has now been deprecated as well. And one very nice improvement from, in my personal opinion, is a complete repurposing of the Docker capabilities and introduction of images from Alpine instead of the old Ubuntu images that have been used in version 1.4, which are much lighter. They are definitely from the security perspective, they're definitely more apt for production environments. And by default, Alpine Linux is in complete lockdown mode, which means that the potential security surface is much reduced, and therefore we spend much less time on making sure that these components representing peers orders, etc., that are based on Alpine images are prone to any vulnerabilities coming from the outside. Another thing is that Alpine Linux images are much smaller, so probably you have already seen it, but the reduction of size is really considerable. It's now around between 60 and 100 megabytes per peer for the order. Last but not least, for the other enhancements, there is an extension of a documentation regarding the rolling update. So the process itself hasn't changed a lot. Important thing is that it's there. So there is a possibility to have a rolling upgrade between 1.4 and 2.0 without any practical or considerable interruptions. There may be some interruption if you want to migrate from Kafka to Raft, but this is not related to the upgrading process, but rather the fact that you intend to change the ordering service network. The new documentation is really well written and very explicit in some things. So I definitely recommend that you take a look into it to start preparing for the migration, even if it's not necessary immediately in the upcoming weeks. So I just wanted to provide you with a couple of conclusions and personal thoughts, and then we can go to Q&A. So there is a number of things that are still missing in Hyperledger Fabric 2.0. However, the roadmap includes these components. So there is still work made around stability and resilience. There's a number of Jira tickets which are still open for these. Token management system is an elephant in the room. And from what I have heard, and from what I have seen on the Jira development roadmap, it is there. It is going to be introduced in subsequent releases of Hyperledger Fabric, and we probably will be able to see a completely new refactored FAB token, or whatever the name is going to be at that point, probably in the latter part of this year. I told about the absence of BFT consensus. From my knowledge, there are currently at least 3 BFT projects that are being developed in parallel. There is one that has been developed around 2 years ago by the University of Lisbon in Portugal. The second BFT consensus that has been built was recently built by NEC Corporation in Japan, and it's called MinBFT. From what I know, they are using it in one of the platforms that they have deployed for their clients. The code is available as open source, of course. There is another BFT consensus that is being developed by IBM Research, and it's there, and I can provide you with a link to the source code if anyone's interested. The very important 2 things about these is that none of them are part of an integral Hyperledger Fabric baseline code. And secondly, they are explicitly not set into production mode. So they're more research efforts rather than commercially, production-ready functionalities that can be used for commercial use in production applications. We are still awaiting for Ledger checkpointing and usability updates around operational readiness, but this is also on the roadmap. And for all of these and others, I strongly recommend that you take a look at the Jira roadmap for up-to-date information. So what do all these changes really mean from the business perspective? It's very important because technology itself can only serve a purpose if there's a business need for that. So my personal thought is that now the organizations can better control the life cycle of their own chain code in their own organization. And until all of the requirements set by the entire organization in terms of policies implemented across the channel, but also the read-write sets, which are verified cryptographically by each of the organizations during the endorsement policy, if they are satisfied, then the entire chain code lifecycle is going to be valid. But this leaves a lot of liberty for the organizations to define their own development process, development roadmap, rolling out, and integration and delivery process, which is definitely helping a lot, especially when a new business logic is being updated on a constant basis. And there are some improvements made by each of the organizations, which for different reasons, whether it is about the intellectual property or others, cannot be shared with the others. Other thing is that the organizations can now better manage the data and pass them on to other organizations with whom they are in a business relationship, and only with those organizations. So there is a much better control in terms of where data is going to, which part of data is seen by which organization, and who can contribute, change, or query that data once it's distributed, either as part of a collection or if it's a public data as part of a distributed ledger. So this is definitely touching upon the privacy and confidentiality requirements that are constantly flowing from business organizations. But what do these changes mean for developers and operators? So there are new things that are coming up and that we can progressively take into account, either at the fabric component layer or from the perspective of chain code and application development. So we've been talking about the approach to the chain code lifecycle and private data collections. This is going to have a vast impact on the way we are developing and rolling out the new business logic into our own peers managed by our organization. The implicit per organization policies for private data collections may be considered as a sort of replacement or as a workaround in absence of some specific solutions for zero-knowledge proofs or when encryption cannot be used. So I'm not saying that these should be considered as parallel or equal solutions. They serve completely different purpose, but depending on the needs of your client and your organization, there may be a possibility to. Someone has not muted himself. Just 1 second. I hear some echoes. Okay, so there is a possibility to better manage the privacy of data and to avoid using some really heavy mechanisms such as zero-knowledge proofs and encryption. The use of Alpine-based images is helping a lot from the security perspective. The use of external chain code launcher is going to give us a possibility to leverage Kubernetes as a way to go for all future deployments of Hyperledger Fabric, especially in cloud environments. And last but not least, the operators can better manage how to deploy different components of Hyperledger Fabric roll them out, and also manage the way chain code is being deployed onto their organization with some specific differences which are unique to their own development process. Okay. There is a further reading attached to this session. So this is only an introduction, and I strongly recommend that you do some additional reading on your own. And I just wanted to anticipate that the next webinar is going to be about deploying IBM blockchain platform on IBM Cloud. Stay tuned and follow my LinkedIn profile, and I will be informing you about the scheduling of that webinar later this or next week. So this is the end from my side, and now let's go to the Q&A. We still have 10 minutes left, so I will try to respond to all of the questions from top to the bottom. Ali Al-Zubaidi is asking, you talked about updating chain codes without reinstalling. Is this applicable to the business logic too? Yes. I mean, from the perspective of chain code, there is no necessity to reinstall the chain code if the update does not concern the change to the content of the business logic. Is updating the chain code conducted consensus or endorsement? No, that is not correct. The updating is still using endorsement policies, but these are not managed at the chain code level, but they are managed by the policies, which I mentioned about in the beginning of the presentation. Where is the chain code installed? This is a very good question. Right now, you can decide where chain code is going to be installed. It can still be installed as a container managed by the peer, but there may be some other external mechanism for externalization of chain code that you can introduce to your specific integration and deployment process, delivery process. Is it on every peer? No, you can decide which peer is going to have chain code installed, and it is not necessary to have chain code installed if that peer is not participating in any transactions. Is it replicated? I mean, the data is still replicated, but the chain code is installed locally, and the chain code itself is not replicated. So Kamlesh is asking, can PPT be shared? Yes, by the end of this session, I will post the PPT on my LinkedIn profile, so stay tuned. Regarding the read, so this is Marek. Regarding the read-write permissions added to the CC data collection, there is no question. Marek, feel free to contact me back on LinkedIn and ask the question. I'll be happy to respond to it. So Kamlesh is answering to Ali. There's another question from Marek. Can this be set within a single CC, and different policies for each contract action have different policies for their users? I think it's going to be a good idea if we have that separate conversation offline, and then we can publish the results of it to the community if you want. Alex McAllister says, will solo consensus type still be available for testing purposes? If my understanding is correct, no. It is still available, but it's in deprecated status, which means that, let's say, my recommendation would be to set up your development environment with a single Raft order. And as a matter of fact, on IBM Cloud, the IBM blockchain platform that is used for evaluation purposes does exactly that. It uses a solo Raft, a single Raft order in order to run the network. Ghost Rider says, for information, wallet management will soon be available in SDK Go too. Thank you for the information. Also, anyone can use SDK in a same way implementation flow as using in SDK node in Java. That's a very good news. Thank you. Carlo, thank you as well. It's good to see you on the call. Ali, is there any benchmarking results available for Hyperledger Fabric 2.0? There is a number of different studies which are either public on Hyperledger Fabric Jira dashboards. You have to search through it. There are also some semi-public data that is circulating here and there. I would personally wait a little bit longer, let's say the next quarter, for the first viable results to come up, which are based on real environments. According to my best knowledge right now, there are no organizations which are using Hyperledger Fabric 2.0 in production. But I will greatly appreciate if you correct me if I'm wrong on that. So I managed to get to the end of the chat window. If there are any questions from those who remained on today's call, you can now unmute yourself and ask the question directly. We still have 5 minutes left. If there are no questions, then I would like to thank you for your time and your attention. Please follow my LinkedIn profile, on which I will publish a link to both the recording, the PowerPoint, and the schedule for the next webinar. And I'm looking forward to seeing all of you on the next session. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Stay safe and stay healthy. Bye-bye.